Today I'm speaking for myself. Formerly I spoke for Elijah Muhammad. And everything I said was, Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and so. I'm speaking now from what I think, from what I have seen, from what I have analyzed, and the conclusions that I have reached. I am not a racist. I don't subscribe to any of the tenets of racism.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. Malcolm X rose from the depths of prison to international renown. His story is a lesson in the power of transformation. What inspired Malcolm X to change? How did he revise his personal beliefs and purpose over time? And what personal qualities did he have that made reinvention possible? In studio with us today is Imam Yasin Dwyer. Imam Yasin is a chaplain at Correctional Services Canada. He'll share with us how he thinks the story of Malcolm X can serve as an inspiration for people in prison. Imam Yasin, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you for having me.
Now, how did Malcolm X end up in prison?
Malcolm X was born into a racist environment, an environment that was based upon the principles of white supremacy. And as a black American, he was the victim of that system.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? Because we don't live in a society like that today, so sometimes it's hard to understand the injustice that he may have experienced.
Well, the black community in America, as the black community in the West, is a community that is born out of enslavement, that the black community in this part of the world are from Africa, and they were enslaved and brought to this part of the world, and eventually a quote-unquote liberation took place. However, the effects of the system of slavery among black people in this part of the world were felt for generations to come, even up until today. So Malcolm X was born in an America that inherited that system. And so there was a system of extreme racial segregation, extreme racial discrimination targeting black people that he and his family suffered from, and black Americans during that time suffered from greatly.
I believe his father was also killed by racists.
His father was a very conscious black American who was a member of a very famous black improvement organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He was actually a very prominent member of that organization. So he was someone who was very independent-minded, very racially conscious, very conscious of the effects of racism in America. And because of that activity, it's believed that he actually was murdered by a white supremacist group. So Malcolm X grew up in this kind of environment, although he grew up in a very racially conscious family, but the murder of his father had a very negative impact upon him, upon his brothers and sisters, and in particular upon his mother.
I remember at one point when I was reading about him, I read that he actually wanted to become a lawyer, but his teacher told him, look, realize who you are, you know, what your race is, and you know, you're probably fit to be a carpenter.
A very famous story, very famous story. Malcolm X had the gift of speech as a young child. He had the gift of a wonderful, sharp intellect, and he wanted to be a lawyer. He aspired to be a lawyer. Anyone who has those kind of skills as a young person would want to aspire to be a lawyer. But his teacher, who was white at the time, told him that, you know, you should aspire to be something else because, you know, your own people would not trust you as a black lawyer, and white people at that time would not hire you as a lawyer, so you should aspire to be a carpenter. So Malcolm X had the spirit of learning, the spirit of education, or the desire to be educated. But, you know, I heard one person describe it as like putting Novocaine in the brain of a young child that aspires to greatness. So you could say that from that time, Malcolm X lost his motivation. And you could say he began adopting some of the self-destructive behaviors that many perhaps would adopt if they didn't have much hope, or they weren't given an optimistic outlook of concerning their potential to succeed in life. Yeah.
So he dropped out and then he turned to a life of crime, it seems.
Yes, it seems that he dropped out of school in grade 8, and from there, the downward spiral began. And Malcolm X, he ended up in jail. He involved himself in a lot of criminal activity that eventually got him arrested and convicted and sentenced to prison.
So his time in prison was a turning point. It seems like he revised some of his ideas in prison. Can you tell us about what happened in prison?
When he first entered prison, it was difficult. Malcolm X, while he was in prison, was looked upon as, in fact, his nickname while he was in prison was Satan. The other inmates used to call him Satan. He, in fact, was a very difficult person to deal with, to get along with, and someone who was identified as very anti-religious. He didn't have much patience for religion. He was very angry, very bitter, very jaded. But what happened while he was in prison, his brother was a member or joined a movement called the Lost Found Nation of Islam. And his brother wrote Malcolm letters inviting him to join the Nation of Islam. And if he did join the Nation of Islam, he would get out of prison. So Malcolm X was very, puzzled by this letter because he didn't understand what this Nation of Islam was all about. Who is this man named Elijah Muhammad, whom they were claiming was a divine messenger? All of these things were confusing to Malcolm, but Malcolm opened his ears and opened his heart to the letters of his brother, and he eventually made the decision to join this movement called the Nation of Islam. Although, as Muslims, there are some difficulties concerning the belief within this movement called the Nation of Islam, but Malcolm X nonetheless was given an introduction to this group, and he again returned to that spirit of learning, that spirit of inquiry, and we're told in the sources that Malcolm X, in his desire to start back from where he left off in grade 8, he read the dictionary. And in fact, some say that he may have memorized the dictionary. He began with the word aardvark, and he began to study words, meanings, syntax, grammar, all of these things. He returned to learning about the world. He went to the prison library and read about Greek philosophy, read about history, read about everything.
So his enthusiasm and passion seemed to have returned then.
Absolutely. It seems as though the message of his brother through the Nation of Islam actually, quickened his spirit to learn and to become, a magnet of knowledge.
So how did he rise to fame with the Nation of Islam?
He left prison, I believe, in 1952, and rose up the ranks of the Nation of Islam. When he left prison, the Nation of Islam perhaps had 500 members across America. Malcolm X became a minister quite quickly because he had the skills to attract and, as Nation of Islam members used to say, to fish converts.
He was very eloquent.
He was incredibly eloquent, and he was able to capture the imagination of many black Americans. And it began with perhaps 500 members, but perhaps by the time that he left the Nation of Islam, it may have had, in the hundreds of thousands of members, primarily because of Malcolm X's oratory, his eloquence, and the sincerity that he had. Black Americans perceived, and even white Americans who may have disagreed with, the content of the message of the Nation of Islam, they seemed to recognize a sincerity and an intellectual sharpness that Malcolm had. So he was able to rise in the ranks of the Nation of Islam, capture the imagination of the American public, and the media caught hold of Malcolm because Malcolm always had something very interesting to say, and he caught the attention of even many international leaders as well. So he really, his fame was built through the Nation of Islam.
How do you think his involvement with the Nation of Islam helped in terms of his personal development?
Well, of course, the Nation of Islam had some very, very strict teachings concerning your own life. Very strict dietary habits. There were habits that, although we can't say were completely Quranic, however, did promote certain virtues that were of benefit to him and many other members of the Nation of Islam. We can look at the Nation of Islam as perhaps like a proto-Islamic group. They use the symbols of Islam, but the actual belief system was not Quranic. So as Muslims, we believe that there is one God. However, the Nation of Islam believed that God is manifested in human beings, that man is God and God is man. Although not every man, black man only. So this is something that actually contradicts the Quranic teachings. And also, they believed as well that a man by the name of Elijah Muhammad, who I mentioned earlier, was a messenger of God. This is contrary. This is antithetical to what Muslims believe. We believe that Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, on whom be peace, is in fact not only the messenger of God, but the last messenger of God. So we can refer to the Nation of Islam as a proto-Islamic group, not completely Islamic, but there were certain virtues that were taught within the Nation of Islam that actually helped many black Americans reform their life and actually, like Malcolm, cure themselves of certain vices that led them to a path of destruction.
Now, you talked about how the Nation of Islam has this emphasis on the black man. How did Malcolm X enlarge his focus to include whites as well?
Well, Malcolm X found some difficulty within the Nation of Islam. He had a conflict with his teacher, Elijah Muhammad, and he was eventually kicked out of the Nation of Islam. However, before he was kicked out of the Nation of Islam, he had been studying traditional Islam, Islam of the Quran, for quite some time. In fact, he and a son of Elijah Muhammad, Warithuddin Muhammad, who eventually took over the Nation of Islam when Elijah Muhammad died, were also, he himself was also a student of traditional Islam. So there was that stream of thought among many members of the Nation of Islam, including those within Elijah Muhammad's family. But Malcolm X, because of a problem that was that he had with Elijah Muhammad, and because of certain jealousies that took place within the leadership of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X was kicked out, and eventually he was given the opportunity by his sister, who at that time was an Orthodox Muslim, to go for the pilgrimage to Mecca, which Muslims are required to do at least once in a lifetime if they're able. He went for the pilgrimage to Mecca.
So what happened then? How did that change him?
Well, I would advise your viewers to actually read Malcolm X's autobiography, and there's one chapter named Mecca. And I couldn't do justice to actually the beauty and the illumination that took place within Malcolm X's heart while he was in Mecca. But in general, Malcolm went to Mecca and he was able to, on a practical level, witness what Islam was really all about. The brotherhood, the fraternity, the spiritual beauty, the happiness, the joy, the begging, the crying, the tears for God. He was able to witness this while in Mecca. In fact, a very famous statement he made in his autobiography, that when he went to Mecca, he was able to recognize that although we do have black, we have white, we have yellow, we have red, every human being snores in the same language. So he was able to recognize that indeed, racism is a reality, but he said the cure to racial intolerance, to racial violence, must be a spiritual cure. And he believed that Islam had the answer to that. In fact, the Quran says, "O humanity, we made you from male and female, we made you into nations and tribes, so that you may recognize each other, so that you may know each other. Verily, the most honored of you, the most virtuous of you, are those who have this wonderful thing called taqwa, which means God consciousness and awareness of God." So our superiority or inferiority is based upon our sense of God consciousness. And Malcolm X was able to recognize that, and he was able to return from his pilgrimage and speak of this wonderful tradition, and at the same time continue to be an advocate for racial justice in America, but of course, in his heart, understanding that racism is that which is learnt. It is not something that is natural in a human being. So you could sum up Malcolm X's life by saying that we need to keep our hearts busy with God and keep our hands busy with the people.
Imam Yassin, I can see how inspired you are by Malcolm X. Thank you for sharing your stories with us, and thank you for appearing on our show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll take a break. When we return, we will look at the threat of antibiotic resistance.